The cameras rolled as the live interview began, the studio bathed in bright lights. Across from the host sat Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director, known not just for his Hollywood success but for his unfiltered opinions. He sat calmly, his weathered face unreadable as the liberal host leaned forward with a smirk, clearly eager to challenge him. "Clint," the host began, adjusting their tie. "You've been in this industry for decades, but some say your old-school views don't fit in today's Hollywood. Do you think your stance is out of touch?" Eastwood, unfazed, tilted his head slightly. "Out of touch with what exactly?" he asked, his deep, gravelly voice carrying through the studio. The host chuckled, sensing an opportunity. "With progress, with the way society is moving forward, you've been criticized for not embracing certain changes. Diversity initiatives, political correctness, things that many see as necessary for Hollywood to grow." Eastwood took a slow breath and leaned forward slightly. "You see, the thing about Hollywood is it used to be about telling great stories. Now it seems like everyone's more worried about checking boxes than making good movies. And if speaking my mind makes me out of touch, then so be it. I've never been one to follow a script I don't believe in." The audience gave a few polite chuckles, but the host wasn't backing down. "But don't you think that kind of mindset is exactly the problem? Some would say that attitude contributes to, let's call it resistance to change." Eastwood let out a low chuckle and shook his head. "You know, I've seen a lot of change in my lifetime. Some of it good, some of it just noise. But one thing that never changes is people trying to tell others how to think. I make movies, I tell stories, I don't tell people what they should believe. And maybe if Hollywood focused more on that instead of lecturing everyone, folks might actually want to go to the movies again." A few scattered cheers rippled through the audience. The host shifted in their seat, sensing control slipping away. "So you don't think Hollywood has a responsibility to push progress?" Eastwood smirked. "Hollywood has a responsibility to entertain, that's it. People go to the movies to escape, not to be preached at. You want to push an agenda? Run for office, otherwise stick to making good films." The studio fell into an awkward silence. The host, usually so quick with a retort, fumbled for words. Eastwood just sat there, cool as ever, waiting. Within minutes, the clip exploded online. Social media lit up with reactions, some praising Eastwood for speaking his mind, others outraged at his bluntness. The host, rattled by the exchange, tried to recover, but the damage was done. The conversation had veered away from their control, and Eastwood had once again proven that no matter how much Hollywood changed, he would always be Clint Eastwood, unapologetically himself. As the show went to a brief commercial break, the host shuffled through their notes, trying to regain composure. Clint Eastwood, ever the professional, remained as cool as ever, sipping his water, eyes casually scanning the room. It was clear he wasn't bothered by the host's failed attempt to bait him. He had been in far worse situations over his decades-long career. The host returned to the camera with a forced smile, trying to maintain their professional demeanor. "Welcome back," they said, attempting to regain the momentum. "We've been speaking with Clint Eastwood, who certainly has a lot to say on these matters. Clint, you've made your views clear, but let's talk about something that's been weighing on many people's minds. In your latest film, let's say you don't exactly present a politically correct version of history." Eastwood's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice remained calm. "History's what it is, whether people like it or not. If we start changing it just to make people feel better, we're doing a disservice to everyone who came before us. You can't sugarcoat the truth," the host pressed on. "But isn't it a little irresponsible to glorify moments in history that may be considered offensive by today's standards?" Eastwood didn't flinch. Irresponsible? Or just honest? You can't rewrite history because it doesn't fit into someone's idea of what's comfortable. If people are uncomfortable with it, maybe they should ask themselves why. The host's eyes twitched, clearly frustrated, but trying to stay composed. "But there's a lot of criticism around your films, Clint. Some say your views are antiquated, maybe even dangerous. Do you not see how that might hurt your legacy?" Eastwood leaned forward slightly, his expression unchanged. "You know, I've been called a lot of things over the years. Dangerous, maybe. But if people are afraid of the truth, they're in for a rough ride. I've never cared much about legacy either. You don't make movies for the critics or to please the masses. You make them because you believe in what you're doing. And if that makes some people uncomfortable, then they can turn off the TV and do something else. The studio was still, tension thick in the air. The host cleared their throat, attempting a last-ditch effort to regain control of the conversation. Well, Clint, it's clear you're not afraid to speak your mind. But in today's world, some might say that's exactly the problem. People who refuse to change with the times. Eastwood's lips curled into a half-smile. The problem is not that people refuse to change. It's that people forget how to think for themselves. The world doesn't need more people pushing an agenda or making rules for how we should live. What it needs is people who aren't afraid to say what's real, even if it's unpopular. The host stared at him, momentarily speechless. It was clear the interview had shifted into uncharted territory. Eastwood's words had thrown the host off balance, and no amount of rehearsed lines could recover from it. The segment wound down, and the cameras rolled toward their final moments. Well, there you have it, the host said, trying to put a positive spin on things, though it was obvious they hadn't won the argument. Clint Eastwood, always outspoken, never backing down. Clint, thank you for your time today. Eastwood nodded. Anytime. As the cameras cut off, the host sat back in their chair, looking down at their notes while Eastwood stood up without any fanfare. He walked off the set with a calm confidence, unaffected by the storm that had just erupted. Outside the studio, the world was already buzzing. Clips of the interview spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with opinions, some praising Eastwood's blunt honesty, others calling him out for being out of touch. But for Clint Eastwood, none of that mattered. He had said what he came to say, and in his mind, that was the only thing worth worrying about. In a world where everyone seemed to be trying to outdo each other with the latest trend or opinion, Clint had reminded everyone that sometimes the truth didn't need to be dressed up in political correctness. It just needed to be spoken. The aftermath of Clint Eastwood's interview was nothing short of chaotic. News outlets, social media platforms, and blogs buzzed with heated debate. Pundits on both sides of the political spectrum were quick to weigh in, some applauding Eastwood for standing firm in his convictions, others criticizing his refusal to adapt to the changing landscape of Hollywood and society. The clip of the interview went viral, and by the end of the day, Clint's name was trending across multiple platforms. One viral tweet read, "Clint Eastwood may be an old man, but he's still got the guts to say what no one else will." Another, from a more progressive corner, called him an outdated relic of the past, but it only seemed to fuel the fire. Eastwood's critics were loud, but so were his defenders. By the time evening came, Eastwood had already moved on. He had long learned to ignore the noise, the fleeting controversies, and the latest online uproars. For him, the real satisfaction came from living life on his terms and making films that mattered to him, not to the latest trend or public opinion. Meanwhile, the host, who had been at the center of the firestorm, felt the weight of the interview settling in. Their inbox was flooded with messages, angry fans of Eastwood, supporters of their own views, and even some Hollywood insiders who whispered their disapproval at the blunt exchange. They had tried to take Eastwood down a notch, but instead it felt as though the tables had turned. The next day, a follow-up segment aired, this time with the host attempting to explain their position in light of Eastwood's bold response. But the damage had already been done. The audience wasn't interested in hearing excuses. They wanted the clash, the back and forth, the spectacle of a man who had lived through decades of change and refused to be molded by it. The host was quick to point out their respect for Eastwood's career, but it was clear they hadn't won this round. In Hollywood, Clint's reputation as a man who wouldn't compromise for anyone had only grown stronger. Rumors began to spread that several young directors, many with progressive ideals, were scrambling to get Eastwood involved in new projects. His unfiltered approach to filmmaking, his no-nonsense attitude toward the changing dynamics of the industry, made him an enigma, a figure whose very presence seemed to defy the norms of modern Hollywood. For Eastwood, it wasn't about the fame or the accolades. He'd seen the world change too many times to care about the latest battle for cultural supremacy. But what mattered to him more than anything was that he'd stood his ground, saying what was true to him regardless of the noise. He wasn't just a relic of the past. He was a symbol of the power of personal conviction in an era that demanded conformity. As the weeks went on, the debate over his interview gradually faded from the headlines, but Eastwood's message lingered. In interviews, on podcasts, and in casual conversations at the bar, people would still reference his sharp words to the host. For a moment, Clint Eastwood had managed to turn the tables on the progressive narrative dominating Hollywood, making it clear that no matter how much things might change, there would always be room for someone who didn't care to fit in. And in a world that often felt too afraid to speak its mind, Clint Eastwood had proven once again that sometimes the best response was the one that shocked everyone and just maybe made them think a little harder. As the weeks passed, Clint Eastwood's interview continued to spark discussions in various corners of the entertainment industry. Critics who had once dismissed him as a relic of the past now found themselves re-evaluating the man who had defied expectations for decades. His legacy, built on a career of unforgettable films and unapologetic stances, was once again at the forefront of public consciousness. In Hollywood, whispers of a new project began to circulate. Rumors spread that Eastwood was in talks with both established and up-and-coming directors who were eager to tap into his unyielding perspective. Some saw his recent outspokenness as a sign that he was preparing to make another bold film, perhaps one that addressed the very issues he had discussed in his interview. Others speculated that Clint, despite his age, was preparing to make a grand statement about the direction of the industry. For Clint, though, the noise around him didn't alter his focus. He knew the entertainment business well enough to understand how quickly the spotlight could shift. He wasn't concerned about whether people agreed with him. He was only concerned with the stories he wanted to tell and the art he wanted to create. His mind wandered to new ideas, new characters, and new worlds he could bring to life on the screen. The idea of changing for the sake of fitting in never crossed his mind, yet the impact of his interview had ripple effects beyond the studio. In political circles, his response to the host was dissected and analyzed, with pundits debating whether his blunt defiance of politically correct ideals was indicative of a broader shift in American culture. Was Clint Eastwood, the icon of the Western genre, the last bastion of a dying breed of film and thought? Or was he a voice that would inspire others to reclaim their own individuality and authenticity in a world increasingly focused on conformity? The days that followed, a new generation of young filmmakers began to publicly express their admiration for Eastwood's unvarnished take on the world. They saw him as a kind of rebellious grandfather figure, someone who refused to be muted by the tides of modern thinking and instead carved his own path. Conversations on social media were filled with praise for Clint's approach to art, politics, and life in general. Many felt emboldened by his words and were inspired to create works that weren't bound by the current cultural zeitgeist, but rather true to their own experiences and perspectives. It wasn't long before Eastwood's words became more than just a one-off moment. They morphed into something bigger, a symbol of defiance in the face of an increasingly polarized world. Clint had managed to strike a chord with those who were tired of being told what to say, what to believe, and what to create. He had reminded them of the power of individualism, of staying true to one's own voice even when it was unpopular or out of step with the prevailing narrative. As for the host of the original interview, they found themselves at a crossroads. The initial backlash against Eastwood's remarks had given way to self-reflection. The host had always prided themselves on being a voice for progress and change, but now they found themselves wondering if they had been too quick to judge Clint. In truth, their attack had been a tactical move, aiming for a viral moment, but it had backfired. They hadn't expected Eastwood's sharp, unapologetic response. Now the host was publicly reconsidering the tone of the conversation, acknowledging that perhaps their approach had been overly dismissive of a man whose legacy in film and culture demanded respect. The days following the interview saw public apologies and acknowledgments from the host's side, along with a deeper, more nuanced conversation about Eastwood's views on Hollywood, politics, and society. People in the media began to question whether the pendulum had swung too far in one direction, and whether a return to thoughtful dialogue, rather than sensationalism, was what audiences truly craved. In the end, Clint Eastwood's brief but impactful moment of defiance had rippled out far beyond the walls of the studio. It had ignited a conversation that touched not just Hollywood, but the very fabric of American culture. He had once again reminded the world that sometimes the best way to respond to an entire system is not through agreement or compromise, but through boldness, honesty, and the courage to stand firm in one's own truth. And though the world continued to change around him, Clint Eastwood remained unchanged, resolute in his beliefs and committed to telling stories that would endure, no matter how much the world shifted. As the months went by, Clint Eastwood's influence seemed to grow, not just in Hollywood but across various facets of American culture. Filmmakers and artists who once tried to follow the prevailing trends now found themselves reassessing their approach. Eastwood's unapologetic approach to his craft was like a wake-up call to those who had long felt pressured to conform to external expectations, whether it was about political correctness, diversity quotas, or any of the numerous ideologies that were influencing the industry at the time. It wasn't just filmmakers either. Writers, musicians, and actors began reflecting on their own work and the pressure they faced to cater to certain audiences or agendas. A renewed sense of authenticity began to emerge in the arts. The fear of being labeled outdated or controversial seemed less daunting for those who now saw Eastwood's defiance as something admirable rather than a flaw. In interviews, Clint himself was remarkably unaffected by the shift. He continued to be focused on his work, approaching his projects with the same level of professionalism he always had. He had no desire to play into the drama, despite the buzz surrounding his interview. Clint was never one for self-congratulation or basking in the spotlight. He simply went about his business, continuing to direct, produce, and occasionally act in films that resonated with him. The creative process remained his priority, and he trusted that his legacy would take care of itself. But the conversation surrounding his comments continued to unfold in interesting ways. Media outlets, once critical of his stance, began to soften their tone. Some even hailed his approach to filmmaking and his refusal to compromise on his values. The Hollywood elite, who once considered him a dinosaur, now took a second look, acknowledging that perhaps his focus on authenticity and story was something worth learning from. He'd proven that an artist could still be relevant, regardless of their views or age, as long as they stayed true to their vision. Meanwhile, the host who had clashed with Eastwood on live television took the opportunity to reassess their approach as well. Over time, they expressed regret over the way the interview had been framed, acknowledging that they had been too focused on creating a soundbite rather than engaging in an honest, open dialogue. The host, though still committed to their progressive values, understood the importance of respecting different perspectives, especially when they came from someone who had spent decades building a career on their own terms. This shift in attitude was reflected in the tone of future interviews, where they made a conscious effort to engage with guests in a more balanced way. What became clear, however, was that Clint Eastwood's legacy was more than just his films. His response during that live TV interview had revealed something deeper about the man: a fierce independence of thought, a commitment to honesty, and a refusal to let anyone dictate the terms of his career or his life. The ripple effect continued, as those in Hollywood and beyond began to reconsider what it meant to be relevant in the modern world. For many, it wasn't about chasing after the latest trends or trying to fit into a box. It was about standing firm in one's values and speaking up, even if it meant going against the grain. Clint Eastwood had, in his own inimitable way, sparked a movement, one that encouraged people to embrace their authenticity, no matter the consequences. And as for Eastwood himself, he continued to live life as he always had, on his own terms. He knew that Hollywood could be a fickle industry, but his career had spanned enough years to remind him that true artistry didn't rely on fleeting approval. It came from creating work that was honest and meaningful, and not just from appeasing the masses. So Clint Eastwood's legend only grew stronger in the aftermath of that one fateful interview. His words became an emblem of individualism, a banner under which many rallied, not just in Hollywood, but across the world. And while the rest of the world scrambled to keep up with the tides of change, Clint Eastwood remained firmly grounded in his own vision, a man who had seen the world change in countless ways and was determined to keep moving forward, no matter what.